Welcome to Unit 7 of the TESOL course at Southern Utah University. In this video we'll discuss culture, the visible and the invisible. In this video we'll define culture as it relates to language learning. We'll talk about cross-cultural awareness and then discuss the terms discourse, genre, and register. In the recent videos we've been talking about the 4 language systems: pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar. Culture is the last of the 4 language systems we'll discuss, and it's one of the largest. What is culture? There's lots of definitions for this term, but here are some of the terms that relate to culture when we think of language learning. One of them is pragmatics. We talked about this in the grammar videos, but pragmatics is knowing when and how to use language. It's also, culture encompasses sociolinguistics. What is the social context of using language, and how is language affected by its social context? We'll get into things like social expectations. What are the thoughts, the feelings, and the actions of people as they interact and use language to communicate? And that's also dependent on the community that they live within. We'll also talk about the practices and values that are used to determine how we interact with others, and the language that we need in order to represent those kinds of relationships. Some researchers will separate culture into visible culture and invisible culture. Sometimes we call this big C culture and little c culture. Big C culture is the things that we often think of as a tourist learning about a culture. The food, the history, the music, the art, the festivals, these kind of really noticeable aspects of a culture. Little c culture is perhaps even more important, but it's much more difficult and less tangible to recognize. This is degrees of politeness, things like body language and social status, daily routines, and expectations of how a conversation functions within the language. As language teachers, yes, it's helpful to know about big C culture, but it's really important to understand little c culture and help our students learn that. When we do talk about culture in the classroom, it's important that we help students develop cross-cultural awareness and recognize what are the expectations of the target culture and how is that different from their home or native culture. But as we do these kind of comparisons, we should never suggest that one culture is better than another. There are differences, certainly in some situations, and we may have a personal preference for one or over another. But it doesn't really do any good to talk about one culture being better or worse than another. It's just different. Also, we want to help our students develop some resilience against culture shock. Culture shock is a natural phenomenon that happens when someone enters a new culture. It doesn't even have to be a new language culture. But as we do that, there are stages of excitement, but also frustration that occur. And so we want to help our students be prepared for that, but also learn to adapt well to the new culture. And understanding how that culture works can help them better adapt. Related to the term of culture is also this term of discourse. We can best define discourse by looking at it according to different terms we've already encountered. So if we think about morphology, that's how words are created and how we form new words. And then we learned in the grammar unit about syntax, and syntax is how sentences are ordered and created. If we move beyond the word level to the sentence level and further up, we get to discourse level. This is connected text beyond the sentence level. This can include things like paragraphs, reports, speeches, conversations. How does individual sentences work together to create meaningful communication? That's what discourse is trying to identify, and discourse is an important part of learning the invisible culture of a language. Related to the idea of discourse is the idea of genre. Genre is a shared understanding about the expectations of a text type. In other words, what we understand a particular form of language to look like. How should it be organized? What kinds of words should it have in it? What kind of information would we expect to find in this particular text type? And when we say text type, we mean both oral and written texts. Here's some examples of genre types: a lab report, a dictionary entry, small talk with a stranger, or a party invitation to a friend, which may be different than a party invitation to an acquaintance. Each of these has some expectations that we expect, what kind of content should be in there, but also what kind of language and how that language is organized. Understanding culture means understanding these different genres and knowing what the expectations are so that, one, we can better understand it as someone who's listening or reading, but also that we can produce an acceptable genre for those who are listening or reading what we create. To help us sometimes with creating appropriate genre and discourse is this concept of discourse markers, or transition terms, sometimes we call them. These are terms that are used to help signal changes or attitudes about the text that we're sharing, about the information that we are delivering. And as readers and listeners, we want to be able to hear these discourse markers that help us understand and navigate the information and bring it together and make sense of it. As speakers and writers, we want to use these terms to help others understand our information and how it's organized and how we feel about it. Here's just some examples of discourse markers. And you can see we've categorized them into 3 categories. Some of them, if you take a moment and stop the video and look at them, which of these are common in spoken language? Which of these are more common in written language? Do they have different functions? What are they trying to show about relationships between sentences or about transitioning from one topic to another? Discourse markers are an important part of understanding the culture of a language. We also want to talk about this concept of register or style. We brought it up before in different videos, but let's just revisit it. Register is considered a form of the language that fits a particular social situation. So we change register frequently throughout the day. Even if we're speaking the same language, our form of that language is changing depending on the context, the relationship, the tone, the environment, and who our listeners or readers are. We adjust our language to fit that situation and the expectations of that situation. And what we're changing is we're changing our pronunciation, our vocabulary, and our grammar. We're making all of those changes because of our knowledge about the culture of that particular situation and what's appropriate there and what is not appropriate in that situation. When a language user doesn't use the right register, people notice. People who are familiar with that language and that culture notice that something's not right. And that can have positive or negative impacts. Usually we want to use the appropriate register for the right situation. So as we think about these 4 language systems, we can see that the first 3 are very important for a successful communication with the last one. We can't use the culture appropriately if we don't have enough vocabulary, grammar, and appropriate pronunciation to be appropriate for the situations where we're going to need it. And so this is an important job that the language teacher has, is to make sure that we lay a foundation with pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, and then we help learners learn how to use those systems appropriately within the larger culture system. So in this video, we've tried to define culture and specifically focus on how culture affects language learning. We talked about being cross-culturally aware, and we've also defined the terms discourse, genre, and register and how they relate to learning the language of a culture.